Hello, everyone, and welcome to MarshWatch. This is the first webinar in the series. My name is Gwendolyn, and I will be guiding you through the English versions of the webinars. The purpose of these webinars is to introduce you to some common marsh birds, amphibians, and plants. And the hope is that after watching these webinars, you will feel inspired to go out and complete your own checklist in a marsh or wetland, or even join our Maritimes Marsh Monitoring program. So today, I'm going to give you some information about the MarshWatch program and how it's going to work. And then we're going to explore the wonder of wetlands and how amazing these environments are. And we're going to talk about different types of wetlands. And then we'll end with contact information in case you want to get in touch with us about questions or concerns about the program. And before we continue, we would like to acknowledge that the Maritimes MarshWatch program operates on the traditional lands of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq peoples. These Indigenous peoples have long had a deep connection with wetlands in the region, and we recognize that Indigenous voices and perspectives are critical for wildlife to continue to thrive on the land. So what is the MarshWatch program? So this is an introductory program to teach the identification of common wetland birds and amphibians by sight and sound. We will also have some plant ID thrown in there. And we also aim to share an appreciation of wetlands. The program is geared towards beginners, but we know from the Prairies version that it can also be helpful for experienced birders. So it consists of 5 webinars that will be recorded and posted on the Maritimes MarshWatch website. And you can use these webinars to guide your learning and refresh your memory each season. They will be a living resource year after year on the website. There is also a guided walk component. In 2025, the first year of the program, the walks will focus on select locations in New Brunswick. And we are open to requests about locations. And we will post the details of each walk on the website and share them on our social media platforms. Again, we will give that information at the end of this webinar. And the goal of the program is for you to feel comfortable submitting a checklist for a wetland in June, July, or August. The ideal timing for checklists is June and early July, because the birds that we target go silent and are much harder to detect once we get to late July and August. This program can also be a great guide for preparing for the marsh monitoring program, which is a slightly more intensive program that operates in the Maritimes. So the webinars themselves will mostly be ID sessions, except for this first webinar. And each ID session will focus on 6 to 8 bird species for a total of 30 birds. This is a lot of information, but again, these webinars will be continuously available on the website, so you can always go back and review. So we're going to teach you how to ID these species by sight and sound. We're going to talk about their habitat preferences and also share some cool facts. And we will also cover 1 to 2 amphibians per webinar for a total of 5 frog and toad species. And again, we're going to teach you to identify them by sight and by sound. And we will cover some plant identification of the major groups and species that you may encounter in wetlands. And this is mostly going to be a useful tool if you decide to join the marsh monitoring program, which has a habitat survey component. So the MarshWatch species, the species we're going to talk about are listed on the slide here. The species in bold are the primary or target species for the Maritimes Marsh Monitoring Program. And we also have the amphibians listed here. And the other species on the slide, they were chosen because they are the most common non-target species that we see recorded in marsh monitoring surveys. So you're likely to encounter these other birds as you complete your surveys. So in each webinar, we will cover a certain number of species, again, 6 to 8, depending on the webinar. And the species are organized so that similar species are covered in the same webinar to allow you to learn how to compare and distinguish these species. So for example, the first ID session, which will be the second webinar, will look at waterfowl, so geese and ducks, shorebirds and grebes, and we'll highlight at the start of each session which species are going to be covered. And then each webinar, again, also covers 1 to 2 amphibians that are common in New Brunswick and that you may hear calling or see hopping along a trail during a survey. So, for example, in the next session, we cover the wood frog and the spring peeper. And for each species, we give really detailed information on how to identify them. So, for example, this is the slide for the American black duck drake or male. And we point out key identifying features and also play a recording of the call or song of the species so that you can start to train your ear to identify them. We will also teach you to distinguish between males and females. So, for example, here's the corresponding slide for the American black duck hen or female. And we point out the differences between the males and the females. This is especially important for species like ducks, which have really strong sex differences. And we cover habitat preferences and diet for each species so that you can get a sense of where you are likely to see these species and what sorts of behaviors you may see them showing. And for species that are quite similar in appearance, for example, mallard females and American black duck females, we give comparisons and point out the best distinguishing characteristics so you can start to learn to identify which species is which. So now that we have a sense of how the program is going to work, let's go ahead and jump into the wonder of wetlands and talk about why these environments are so important and amazing. So what is a wetland? In a scientific sense, a wetland is defined as land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes as indicated by poorly drained soils, vegetation, and other biological activity adapted to a wet environment. That definition comes from the National Wetlands Working Group in 1997. But that is quite a technical definition, so what does that actually mean? Well, wetlands are that dynamic transition habitat. They're kind of an in-between space between water and dry land. So they're not quite a lake, but they're not quite upland habitat either. So you're definitely going to need some rubber boots, waders, or even a boat to get around in them. And they are characterized by having poorly draining soils. So essentially the soil is waterlogged. And they support plants and animals that are adapted to a wet environment. So they have very specialized flora and fauna. In the Maritimes, there are 2 main categories of wetlands, inland and coastal. Inland wetlands are not directly affected by the tides, whereas coastal wetlands drain directly into coastal waters. So they are influenced by tides and are often brackish, meaning that the water is slightly salty. Brackish water usually occurs in areas of mixing between freshwater and saltwater. Within these 2 major categories, there are different types of wetlands, and you will be asked to identify these types if you ever do a marsh monitoring habitat survey. So let's take a look at what those types look like. So in the inland category, the first type is a marsh, and there are deep and shallow marshes. So deep marshes are permanently flooded to a depth of less than 2 meters. Marshes in general are characterized by standing or slow-moving water. And All types of marshes have reeds and cattails, this kind of tall vegetation growing along the edges. Deep marshes also have eelgrass and pond lilies, so these vegetation that requires deeper water. And shallow marshes are only periodically flooded, so they dry out by the midsummer. Again, because they are marshes, the water is standing or slow moving, and they have reeds and cattails like deep marshes, but they do not have the eelgrass or pond lilies that require that deeper water. The second type of inland wetland is a peatland, and again, there are two subtypes here. So peatlands in general are characterized by a layer of decaying plant matter, which is known as peat. And bogs are specifically fed by rainwater. They have very acidic soils, and they are dominated by sphagnum moss and ericaceous shrubs, for example, cranberries and blueberries. Black spruce trees are basically the only trees that you will see growing in bogs. And interestingly, they are also home to carnivorous plants like pitcher plants and sundews. And this is because the nutrient-poor conditions favor an alternative strategy for plants where they can get nutrients from insects rather than from the soil. And fens, in contrast to bogs, they are fed by rainwater and groundwater, and they are much more nutrient rich than bogs. So they support a different group of plants. So they have grasses and sedges, mosses, different types of trees, mostly tamarack and black spruce. And you can also find orchids growing in fens. The third type of inland wetland is swamp, which is also known as a wooded wetland. So these are periodically or permanently flooded, and they have mineral-rich soil, and they contain a variety of shrubs or trees. So one subtype is the shrub swamp, which again has those lower growing woody shrubs. And then you also have forest swamps, which have a variety of trees growing. And then looking at the other major type of wetland, the coastal wetland, again, these drain directly into coastal waters and sometimes have brackish water, but not always. And there is a distinction between general coastal wetlands and salt marshes. Salt marshes are coastal wetlands that are flooded and drained twice a day by the tides. And that makes them a unique type of environment for plants and animals, as opposed to a coastal wetland that may only flood seasonally. So, are wetlands important? In a word, yes, they are. They perform a variety of critical functions. So they absorb floodwater, recharge groundwater, sequester carbon, and purify water, essentially acting as natural sponges that hold a lot of water. They also prevent shoreline erosion. This is particularly important for salt marshes, for example, but they also dissipate stream energy so that the eroding power of rivers is limited. And of course, they provide food and essential habitat for lots of animals and also for humans. So looking more closely at how these wetlands can act as a sponge and have purifying properties, they are actually used by humans in some cases to filter groundwater or runoff. So this is an example of a constructed wetland just outside of Moncton, New Brunswick in Barrie Mills. And it was built in collaboration with Ducks Unlimited Canada to filter polluted meltwater from an adjacent snow dump. So snow often has lots of contaminants, especially road salt. And the wetland, again, acts as that sponge. The water seeps very slowly through it. The contaminants get removed, and then the purified water flows into other waterways. And in addition to keeping the waterways clear, this wetland provides habitat for wildlife. And in general, wetlands provide lots of diverse habitat for wildlife. So wetlands are a very critical nesting habitat for many birds. Lots of birds will make their nests either right in, above, or at the margins of wetlands. And you can see that there's a huge diversity of species that use wetlands in this way, not just waterfowl, but also shorebirds like Wilson's snipe, and little songbirds like the yellow warbler and marsh wren. And wetlands also are critical for providing essentially nursery habitat for species like ducks. So for example, this blue-winged teal will build its nest away from the wetland, but then travel to the wetland to raise the chicks once they've hatched. And these wetlands provide a safe environment for the chicks where they are able to grow and feed on the vegetation that's available. And fishless wetlands can be very prolific for invertebrates, making really great food factories for especially birds. So for example, these images show scuds, which are related to shrimp. They're a type of small crustacean, and they breed in wetlands. And there are many species of animal that rely on these scuds as an important food source. And many mammals, amphibians, and insects rely on wetlands for habitat. So they're not just habitat for birds, they're also important habitat for lots of other species. And they are also important stopover sites for birds, especially migratory birds traveling to their breeding or overwintering grounds. In particular, long-distance shorebirds use wetland shallows and mudflats to be fuel. So for example, here in the Maritimes, the Bay of Fundy is a critical stopover point for migrating shorebirds. And for these species, refueling sites are really important because they travel thousands of miles between their breeding and non-breeding grounds. And so they require the opportunity to refuel in order to be able to make that flight. And there are many fish species as well that use wetlands. So American eels use salt marshes as critical habitat, and they are an important food source for many other species like this great blue heron, but also for humans. And eels are a traditional food source, for example, for the Mi'kmaq, and they hold a spiritual significance in their culture. So these species, again, it shows how important wetlands are for all kinds of species, including ourselves, that use these habitats. And hatches of midges and other non-biting insects are an important food source for a variety of species, especially aerial insectivores like tree swallows and purple martins, but also for other birds like this little mallard duckling. And again, because they are so abundant, they are an important source of protein for many species. And wetlands are also important for ecosystem connectivity. They connect with other ecosystems in really surprising ways. For example, water boatmen, which are a species of invertebrate that is quite common in wetlands, they will move in between wetlands and nearby river systems. In the fall, they will go to those nearby river systems and become important food sources for fish. So they allow important nutrient cycling between wetlands and other ecosystems like rivers. Now, unfortunately, wetland loss in southern portions of Canada is estimated at 70%, with agriculture and development being largely to blame. And it is estimated that in New Brunswick, 65% of coastal wetlands in particular have been lost. And in the Maritimes more generally, the loss of coastal wetlands is a big concern. Again, mostly this happens when these wetlands are converted into agriculture. And the Nature Trust of New Brunswick estimates that this loss of coastal wetlands causes habitat loss for at least 50 bird species, many of which are at risk already. So this is a real concern for conservationists. But all is not lost. So in recent years, governments and nonprofit organizations have moved to protect and restore wetlands across the Maritimes. So for example, this satellite image shows a restored salt marsh at Beausejour in southern New Brunswick. This was a project undertaken by Ducks Unlimited Canada, which involved removing an outer dike to allow the salt water to reflood the marsh. The government of Nova Scotia has restored several salt marshes to mitigate the harmful effects of development in other areas. And across Canada, there is the Coastal Restoration Fund provided by Fisheries and Oceans Canada that provides financial support for efforts like shoreline stabilization and managed dike realignment, essentially, which means moving dikes backwards away from the shoreline so that there is space for salt marshes. And there are also many initiatives to build or restore inland wetlands as well. So how you can help is by supporting organizations that are involved in wetland restoration. For example, Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, Clean Foundation in Nova Scotia, and the PEI Watershed Alliance. If you own coastal property, use sustainable erosion control measures, for example, living shorelines as opposed to rock walls. And even if you don't own this kind of property, you can get involved in living shoreline efforts with conservation organizations to promote these sustainable initiatives. And in general, you can advocate for increased protection for wetland habitats. So be loud about saving these habitats so that they can continue to provide space for wildlife. And with that, we've reached the end of our first webinar. So thank you for taking the time to learn about wetlands and the Marsh Monitoring Program. We also want to thank our supporters, the Wolastoqey Nation of New Brunswick and the Government of New Brunswick for their financial support for this project. If you have any questions about the program, don't hesitate to reach out so you can contact me. My email is listed on the slide. And you can also visit our website for information or to find the recordings of all the webinars. And if you want to keep up to date with programs and events that are put on by Nature NB and Birds Canada, please visit our websites or you can follow us on various social media platforms. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you for the next webinar.